So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to another episode of Tending Lilith's Fire with Kohenet Matan and myself, Devorah Grenn. We've talked about a range of subjects this morning before arriving at the one we want. And I think we've started with the passage about Lilith leaving the Garden of Eden because she chose loneliness over subservience. And that took us into a variety of questions about creation, about domination, about the original couple having anything in common. And I think I'm going to turn that over to you to also reframe and expand on that a bit on the trauma piece, Annie.
Yeah. And we were talking about the relationship between trauma and patriarchy, and the capacity to the relationship between the challenges in healing from trauma and patriarchy. And I was saying, as we got into, as we sort of started to dive into these things, it felt very heavy, and we were, oh yeah, we've had trauma, we've had challenges, and I came back to a phrase that Devorah introduced me to, which is, what would Lilith do? And I wanted to name, it would be good for us to be able to both embrace Lilith's power in her choosing to leave a situation of subservience, violence, domination, where she was being dominated. So yes, we want to be able to say, fuck this, I'm out of here. And also, I was wondering, because of this reading that says that choice led her to loneliness, which was better than subservience. And I don't want to have to choose loneliness to get out of subservience. So I want to know, what would Lilith have done before her trauma? And what was she like? And how can we somehow take these parts and heal them for her and for ourselves?
So I want to say that this quote, which was from Aviva Cantor about her choosing loneliness over subservience in an early issue of Ms. Magazine, is in an article that I wrote for this wonderful book, which I hope will show up here, Original Resistance, Reclaiming Lilith, Reclaiming Ourselves, from Girl God Books, and edited by Trista Hendren and Monette Chilson and Pat Daly, and part of their amazing collection of anthologies. And in fact, I just want to give a shout out to them on a second point, which is they will be coming out with a book in October, or no, maybe by the end of the year, I think, on remembering the goddess and looking at how patriarchy perpetuates trauma. So that's been also very much up in my mind these last couple of days.
Yeah, it's these books that led us to this conversation. So here we go. Now you know the foundations on which we stand.
Yes, exactly. And all of these works, and many of the works that we've read over the years, certainly look at the dangerous parts of patriarchy, part of which I think is the almost hidden, almost invisible thread that runs underneath all our institutions and all our organizations. And until we are told about them and our attention is called to them, we've been kind of living with them. I think the Me Too movement made us also very aware of certain things that become normalized in a corporate culture, for example. And when nobody was being called to task and called out and possibly arrested and punished for a rape at the office, for example, I think it was just easier for women often not to talk about it. Also because, as you talked about a minute ago, they knew they would not be believed. They knew there was a good chance they wouldn't be believed. So that's a whole other tangent we could go on. Go ahead.
Otherwise, yeah, I think in addition to not being believed, there's that uncomfortable space in between of maybe believed, but told it's not that bad.
Right.
So, oh, he didn't hit you. Oh,
exactly. Or he hit you, but he didn't give you a black eye. He didn't break a rib, so it's not that bad.
Yes.
Unfortunately, because of internalized oppression and this kind of gaslighting that people do who are abusive to their partners, a woman herself or a man, if he's the one being abused, comes to this idea on their own that, well, my abuse isn't as bad as somebody else's. My neighbor lost a tooth or ended up in the hospital with broken ribs, but he's just calling me stupid, or he's just, not letting me drive the car unless it's okay with him, and I tell him where I'm going, or he controls the money,
Right.
or.
Yeah. And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just trying to lessen the impact of what they are going through, and there really are no comparisons in this sense, because one is not necessarily worse than another because it's more visible. Right. Some of the deepest wounds are invisible.
Right. And we talk a lot here about partner violence, gender-based, mostly gender-based partner violence. And I had experience of this kind of, it's not that bad thinking about gender-based violence when I was a kid from my dad. And, one of my sisters said when we were kids, oh, dad's abusive. And I said, no, he doesn't hit us. We don't have black eyes. And that came from a commercial for kids' help phone, where, a kid is at a payphone at night in the rain with a black eye, like calling to say, I'm scared. I can't remember what the kid said, but, could call kids' help phone and talk. And I remember thinking about calling and being like, but my situation is not bad, and this can't really be what that is, because it doesn't look as severe, or as there's a stereotypical piece. I don't know what the right word is for that, but it's like we look for a model to help us identify our experience.
Right.
And if we don't see a model that looks like our own experience, then we trivialize or discount our own experience. Right. We say it can't fit that category because I haven't seen something that looks like this. Even the idea that you mentioned, gaslighting, emotional abuse and gaslighting, we didn't have public discourse about these things or models about these things until quite recently.
Right.
So just to name, and that also, it's still, when you talk about, the negative things about patriarchy, I feel like many of us are just learning the language to describe the nuances of the systems, whether patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and, to describe the systems that keep us stuck in those patterns and how harmful they are to people of all genders. We have toxic masculinity, and it feels like such a challenging time to find, I was going to say it feels like a challenging time to find our empowerment and our voice. It's like the best time it's ever been, and still a challenging time because we don't really have the language yet, at least in mainstream culture, to make plain or identify with the experiences that we have had or are trying to heal from or are seeing even.
Right. And so I want to bring us back to what you raised. You're looking at this through an archetypal, mythical lens, and asking what would Lilith do in this situation. And you raised a very interesting point about who was she before, when she was considered divine, when she was considered a goddess and not a demon, not demonized by the patriarchy. And so I would ask you that question, what would she have done before she was in this situation where she was being dominated and felt she had to flee?
Yeah, and I would like to ask you to just tell us, if you can, for many folks, they've never heard of a Lilith the domination scene, or a Lilith who wasn't demonized,
or a Lilith, period.
Or a Lilith at all, right? We've talked a bit about the story of Lilith, so we don't have to retell the whole thing. But it was news to me that the origins of Lilith had positive connotations and feminist connotations, and so if you could speak to that.
Sure. Because she was the first woman before Eve in mythology, and if you have heard of her, you've probably only heard that she was a child-stealing witch, a succubus, a seductress, an impossible woman, uppity for sure, and maybe violent, certainly rageful, but you don't hear that it was on behalf of others, not on behalf of herself, for example. you may hear that she's a whore, a harlot, as is often said about strong women, simply because they are choosing their own sexuality. And so things like that. And the other thing we were talking about before we started recording was the viewpoint of scholars like Lucia Birnbaum in Black Madonnas, who posed the fact that they felt, and I believe Eleanor Gaydon also in The Once and Future Goddess felt this, that perhaps she was a protector who a woman might have called on in childbirth, especially because in Mesopotamia, let's say 4,000 years ago, that was a very tricky business. Many children would be sick or die or stillborn. And so she was a way of calling in protection. And I suspect also if there was a miscarriage or a rape or even an abortion, that a woman might have either blamed Lilith or called on her for protection because that was convenient, you know, and a comfort if they were calling on her for help. So there are those pieces that you never hear about. You just hear about, especially later in the Talmud, if you see her, this wicked demon, this horrific figure, you must cross the street. You must do everything in your power to stay as far away from her as possible.
Right.
Anyway, you have something to say.
Yeah, and so that powerful Lilith that would have been invoked in times of worry, especially around, like, by women, especially around their bodies, their birthing, their cycles, who I'm curious about, like, who's that Lilith? And so, you know, what you were asking, I just wonder about, you know, maybe because we don't know where in the story, in the narrative of first, you know, in creation, there was a Lilith and an Adam. This is the myth that explains why man and woman were created twice in the Torah. And I thought, you know, maybe they coexisted for a while, just as themselves, kind of, you know, living together, doing their own thing. I think about her at that time in kind of a maiden archetype, where there's innocence and power and like self-possession, before the time when she and Adam tried to make it work together. And the only model, for whatever reason, that Adam had access to try and make it work together was for him to be dominant. And she said no. But and that thus led to her sacrifice, right, of herself, of to save herself, she sacrificed companionship, and became an outsider henceforth.
Yeah, and people would justify that, let's say, or validate it by saying, well, he became that way because God said he should have dominion over everything in the garden, including her and the animals and the plants.
Right, that's a translation. You know, I want to draw attention to the agenda behind the translation, because the language doesn't say dominion, it says guardian. It says, you know, Shmer. Now I'm like wanting
to. It's an interpretation, you're
yes.
saying.
Yeah, it's an interpretation of language that other traditions and other teachers and many like the Jewish tradition and other traditions also take the creation story and say that humans were created as guardians over the earth, as protectors, guardians, and partners. And I believe that the translation and it has an agenda that says man was created to dominate everything else, and that included woman.
Thank you for bringing in that newer language, because the guardian, of course, Shmer Eretz, I guess you would say.
Shmer
Adama, would have a whole different function and purpose, and absolutely the wording, as we know throughout the Bible, Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, you know, are often, they were originally, I think, constructed to support social control by religion and by men especially, and they are used now constantly to validate certain kinds of behavior, and we know that. So I'm glad you're bringing this in.
These texts are full of problematic passages, even before we translate, but some of them, if we look at the root meanings of the words, have more nuance available, have more flexibility available, and then the translation fixes them to this particular agenda. So yeah, that's a question, you know, we talk. So now I'm curious not only about, you know, what happens if we ask the question, what would Lilith do? But also, if Lilith and Adam understood God as telling them to be partners with the earth and everything and each other, like maybe Adam just misinterpreted the instruction. Like what happens to that story? And the story of Lilith comes later. That's not written into the original Torah text. It's a rabbinic story to explain what I like to call a blip in the matrix. And so there's space in between the original story and the agenda that was then overlaid. And I'm curious about what we can do with that space in between and how we can find possibility and strength and potential for different models of being and of partnership that can serve us now, in our reframing of the necessities of how we make these choices. Like,
right. Well, I think one really useful exercise, and I'm mindful of the time, we have a few minutes left, but I want to say one good exercise might be to do a retelling, to write a midrash to imagine her in her power, in a whole different space. If she's operating as a single person and he's a single person and they're getting along and meeting, they're maybe having meals together once in a while, but they're not living in a domestic, having a domicile together in the garden in that same way of as if married. And those qualities are strong in her. And then it would be wonderful to look at what does that mean for us as a model, as opposed to the kind of strength that she finds when she has to leave the garden. And I mean, those are also good qualities, but they're in response to male behavior. So wouldn't it be interesting? Yes, I agree, to look at who she was when she came out of the primordial soup that they were both birthed from, or the
earth,
the bloody clay, the Adamah,
yes,
which is how Posey Fabian translates Adamah.
Yeah, and I my response to the Aviva Cantor quote about Lilith choosing loneliness over subservience, and if I'm reimagining and taking this concept of partnership to heart, she wasn't alone. It wasn't just Lilith and Adam. They had a relationship with all living things, right. And we've talked elsewhere about the power of having a circle for support in moments when we encounter experiences that we don't know how to handle or that are harmful. And so I wonder, what if Lilith had called her circle of the animals, and had them sit with her and help her decide what to do. That's one possibility before she leaves. And then the other is, what if when she left the garden, she didn't leave into a black void of loneliness. Right. She left into the embrace of other powerful beings who said, good for you for choosing yourself over that. Right. And come join us in this other space that isn't the false paradise that has been presented in the framing of Eden.
I do think of it that way, her leaving the garden, crossing the Red or Reed Sea to live in the caves. But the patriarchal recounting is that she was promiscuous or that she was consorting with demons. And I often don't think of it that way, but that she went to live with other free spirits on the beach and where there was a beautiful cave.
Right. And how perfect, because she was demonized. And so, of course, anyone she went to spend time with who bucked the constraints of that system would also have been demonized. Right. So now I'm like, great, who were those demons? I want to know them. They're probably my people. They probably, so then who gets demonized in these traditions, and what are their actual powers that are being I need another word than demonized, but villainized, right? But the powers that are being made
as if they're negative instead.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like, what are those superpowers before this overlay of villain is put on them? And if we talk about writing creatively about it, I'm super curious to explore who is Lilith hanging out with outside of Eden, and because we know Eden was not paradise,
Right.
Probably for anybody, actually, if we're looking at it through the frame of dominance, but certainly not for the women in our
Right.
stories.
Right.
Maybe getting out of there, I believe, getting out of there in the space when we leave behind the supposed utopia, that is really the space of possibility and the space of growth and the space of allowing us to be ourselves.
Absolutely. And a very scary space to enter, because you often have to risk everything you have to go there, and maybe have nothing, but you have your freedom and you have your voice. So I think this is fascinating, and a conversation we should certainly continue and pick up again, to look at these possibilities. And also want to call people's attention to the feminist literature, starting really with Judith Plaskow and her retelling of the story, where Lilith came back and met Eve, and they became friends outside the gates of the garden. And there are many other retellings. There is a book called Witch, W-H-I-C-H, Lilith, which is an anthology of some wonderful stories and poetry also about her, and many other resources. And I also just want to put in a plug for Lilith Institute and Lilith's Fire Circle, which will be starting up its second cohort on September 18. Both are spaces in which we explore a lot of these questions, these issues, and we bring it very much into what parts are relevant for us today. Because one last thing I wanted to say when you were just talking is that those qualities for which she was vilified are the same qualities for which women are vilified today. Strong women, women with a voice, with an opinion, with an idea, especially, let's say, in a corporate meeting where their idea is the best one around the table, and she's considered a bitch for even bringing it up, or too aggressive, as opposed to a man who would be praised mightily for having this great idea, right? Which is why they are often stealing our ideas and not crediting us, even at the same table, 5 minutes after the woman utters the idea. And so we need to call, and we want to, and we do encourage always calling these things out as we see them, as well as we are calling out patriarchy, white supremacy, racism, and homophobia, and just so many other things that we are aware run through our society. So those are my closing words. Annie, do you have something? Or
yeah, I feel like that's great, and I'm excited to continue the conversation about what's outside of Eden. And you talked about the strength to choose the unknown and how scary that is. And I want to be building a world in which stepping out isn't stepping out into an abyss, but stepping out into an embrace. And that I acknowledge that part of what's scary about it is that even though there are many of us exist in systems that are harmful, but the familiarity and the knowledge that someone else has got it, like the feeling that the container is held, even if it's bad for us, is part of what keeps us from stepping out of it. And so I think part of what's scary about the unknown is that we have to create it ourselves. We have to create that healthier space ourselves. And for some of us, for many of us, that's just terrifying. It's easier to let someone else make the rules. And I want to challenge that and look at it and reframe so that we're not always choosing hard in order to choose healthy.
And I think one last thing, that I think a lot of that would be easier if girls were raised as much with encouragement to take risks as boys often are. To get our hands dirty, to be comfortable with messy.
And mistakes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got lots more to talk about next time.
We do.
Thanks for joining us. And you'll find links to information that we mentioned in the description of this video, as well as links to find out more about our work and what we are up to.
Great. So please come and visit us at the YouTube channel, and you'll see an array, our whole archive from the past year and a half almost of recordings and broadcasts. And we welcome, as always, your comments and feedback.
Yes. Thank you.